Imagine you're sitting in a cockpit about the size of a phone booth. You've been airborne for 14 hours. There's nowhere to stretch your legs. You're wearing a pressure suit, you're breathing recycled air, and somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, you realize you still have 22 hours left to fly. This is what B-2 Spirit stealth bomber pilots do. Regularly. The B-2 flies missions that last up to 44 hours, sometimes longer. That means takeoff in Missouri, a strike on a target anywhere on Earth, and a landing back where you started, all without touching the ground. And for most of that time, there are exactly 2 people responsible for a $2.1 billion aircraft and whatever it's carrying. So the question is obvious. When do they sleep? And what happens to the plane while they do? The answer involves fold-out bunks, oxygen delivery tubes, and a level of human engineering most people never think about when they see that aircraft on the news. To understand how this works, you have to start with the aircraft itself. The B-2 Spirit entered service with the U.S. Air Force in 1997. It's a flying wing design, which means there's no traditional fuselage, no tail fins, just a smooth, boomerang-shaped aircraft that reflects almost no radar signal. The Air Force only ever built 21 of them. As of today, 20 remain operational. Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri is the only place they're stationed, which means every single B-2 mission in history has started from the same patch of tarmac in the middle of the country. The plane has a crew of 2, a pilot and a mission commander. They fly side by side in a cockpit that, despite the aircraft's massive 172-foot wingspan, is genuinely cramped. The B-2 wasn't designed for crew comfort. It was designed to be invisible, and that's exactly the problem when you need to fly it for 44 hours straight. The Air Force knew early on that 2-person crews couldn't stay sharp across missions of this length. Fatigue doesn't just affect comfort, it affects judgment, reaction time, and decision-making at the exact moments when all 3 matter most. So they built a solution into the plane itself. Behind the 2 cockpit seats, there's a small rest area, a fold-out bunk, not much bigger than a sleeping bag laid flat. There's also a toilet, a small galley, a microwave, and space to store food. It's not a hotel room, it's barely a closet, but it gives one pilot the ability to step away from the controls while the other manages the aircraft. The protocol works in shifts. One pilot flies while the other sleeps. Typically, the rest periods run somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, though the exact schedule varies depending on mission length and crew preference. Before either pilot rests, they brief each other on the flight plan, any expected weather, any sensitive phases of the mission coming up. Then one of them heads to the back, and the other stays up front alone. This is where things get interesting, because alone in a B-2 means something very specific. The aircraft is heavily automated. The fly-by-wire system handles most of the moment-to-moment control inputs. Autopilot manages crews. The mission systems on board can track targets, adjust routes, and handle a long list of tasks without constant human input. So the pilot who's awake isn't manually flying the plane every second. They're monitoring it, watching for anomalies, staying alert to anything the automation flags. But they are alone, for hours at a time, at altitude, over open ocean. No co-pilot in the seat next to them, no one to catch a mistake. The Air Force is careful about who gets to this point. B-2 pilot selection is some of the most rigorous in the entire service. Candidates need thousands of flight hours, previous assignments in other aircraft, exceptional performance reviews, and a psychological profile that suggests they can handle extended periods of isolation without losing focus. The washout rate for B2 qualification is significant. Being a great pilot isn't enough. You have to be the right kind of person. Once pilots are assigned to Whiteman's 509th Bomb Wing, the unit that flies all B2s, training for long-duration missions is built into the curriculum from day one. Crews practice sleep scheduling. They study fatigue management the same way they study navigation or weapon systems. There's research to back all of it up. The military has funded extensive studies on pilot performance degradation across extended sorties, and those findings directly shape how B2 crews structure their rest periods. If you've ever pulled an all-nighter and noticed your thinking felt off somewhere around hour 20, you have a rough idea of what unmanaged fatigue does. Now imagine that happening in a $2.1 billion aircraft with a weapons payload and no runway beneath you. The protocols exist because the alternative is genuinely dangerous. One of the other tools crews use is the rest tube, which sounds almost absurd until you understand the physics of it. Pilots in pressurized aircraft are breathing filtered, recycled air. At altitude, even in a pressurized cabin, there's less oxygen than you'd have at sea level. Mild hypoxia, the condition where your blood isn't fully saturated with oxygen, causes subtle cognitive impairment that pilots often don't notice themselves. The rest tube delivers a slightly higher concentration of oxygen to a resting pilot, improving the quality of their sleep and helping them wake up more alert. It's one of those details that sounds minor until you realize it's the difference between a pilot waking up sharp and a pilot waking up foggy in an aircraft moving at 650 miles per hour over the ocean. We cover military stories like this every week. If that's your thing, subscribe. The food situation is its own logistics problem. Missions of this length require real caloric management. Crews eat prepackaged meals similar to military MREs, but often supplemented with higher quality options from the flight kitchen at Whiteman. Caloric intake matters for alertness. Skip too many calories across a 40-hour mission, and your cognitive performance drops whether you're sleeping properly or not. There's a reason the Air Force has dietitians involved in mission planning for extended sorties. It sounds like overkill right up until the moment it isn't. Then there's the psychological side, which the military talks about less, but which pilots themselves have described in interviews. Being alone in a cockpit for 6+ hours at 40,000 feet over open water in an aircraft that has no parallel anywhere in the world is a specific kind of experience. Some pilots describe a meditative quality to it. The hum of the engines, the blackness outside, the instruments glowing in front of them. Others describe it as genuinely difficult, a test of mental discipline that doesn't get easier just because you've done it before. The isolation is real, the stakes are real, and there's nowhere to go. One pilot who spoke publicly about long B-2 sorties described the experience as a managed loneliness, a phrase that probably captures it better than any technical description could. You know there are people on the ground monitoring your flight. You know your crew partner is a few feet behind you, but in the immediate moment, it's just you, the aircraft, and a very long night. The longest confirmed B-2 mission on public record is from March 2003, during the opening days of Operation Iraqi Freedom. B-2 crews flew combat missions from Whiteman Air Force Base all the way to Iraq and back. Those sorties clocked in at roughly 44 hours. 2 pilots, 1 aircraft, one of the longest combat sorties in aviation history at that point. They landed back in Missouri the next morning. What makes those missions worth examining isn't the distance or the duration in isolation. It's the combination of everything required to sustain two human beings at peak performance across that window of time. The engineering of the aircraft, the sleep protocols, the oxygen delivery, the food planning, the psychological screening, the training curriculum, all of it converging on the goal of keeping two people sharp enough to make life and death decisions at the end of a 44-hour day. The B-2 gets a lot of attention for what it can do, its stealth technology, its precision weapons capability, its ability to strike anywhere on Earth within hours of takeoff. Those things are genuinely impressive. But the quiet story, the one that doesn't make the headlines, is the human engineering required to make the machine work. The plane is only as capable as the people flying it, and keeping two people functional, alert, and mission-ready across nearly 2 days in a glorified closet is its own kind of accomplishment. The Air Force has gotten very good at it. The 509th Bomb Wing has flown combat missions from Missouri to Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and landed every crew back home. The sleep protocols work. The training works. The aircraft systems that allow one pilot to rest while the other monitors work. But it is worth pausing on what work means here. It doesn't mean easy. The pilots who do this are managing fatigue the same way athletes manage physical training, deliberately, systematically, with an awareness that the body and mind have limits that cannot simply be willed away. The difference is that athletes train to win games. B-2 pilots train to stay functional in a situation where being wrong costs more than any of us will ever want to calculate. Next time you see footage of a B-2 banking against a gray sky, know that somewhere in that sleek, silent aircraft, someone just woke up from 4 hours on a fold-out bunk, ate a microwave meal at 40,000 feet, and walked back to the cockpit to spell their crewmate so they could do the same. That's the job. There's another story on screen if you're not done yet.
In 1960, the Air Force figured out how to keep nuclear-armed bombers in the sky every single hour of every single day. 12 B-52s, always airborne, always loaded, always within striking distance of a Soviet target. The crews flew 24-hour patrols over the Arctic and the Mediterranean, carrying thermonuclear weapons. And somehow, in between watching fuel gauges and waiting for a launch order everyone hoped would never come, they had to figure out how to eat, sleep, and not lose their minds. That program ran for 8 years. It ended in 1968. But the B-52 never stopped flying missions long enough to break a normal person. Today's crews still pull 20-hour sorties, sealed inside a 60-year-old airframe with no bed, barely a toilet, and almost no privacy. So how do 5 people survive most of a full day locked inside a flying tube without going insane? Or worse, falling asleep at the controls of a nuclear-capable bomber? Let's get into it. Here's what almost nobody outside the squadron understands about this job. People picture a fighter pilot, alone in a cockpit, screaming through the sky for an hour or two. That's not this. The B-52 is enormous, longer than a basketball court is wide, and it carries 5 people scattered across 2 separate levels that barely connect. Upstairs, the pilot and co-pilot sit side by side at the controls, with the electronic warfare officer behind them watching for threats. Downstairs, in a windowless compartment with no outside view at all, the navigator and radar navigator work the radar and the bomb run calculations, staring at screens in a room some crews have called the black hole, because that's exactly what it feels like after 12 hours. They take off as a team, but the moment the wheels leave the ground, that team effectively splits into two separate worlds that talk to each other over an intercom and almost never see daylight at the same time. The pilots watch the sun move across the sky for 20 hours straight. The navigators downstairs can't see outside at all. They know what time it is by their watch and by what the pilots tell them, not by anything their own eyes can confirm. That isolation sounds small until you remember these are the people calculating bomb runs and reading enemy radar. So the intercom discipline on this aircraft is almost obsessive. Every position calls out what they're doing before they do it, because the alternative is two crew members working off two different pictures of reality without realizing it. 12 hours into a mission, exhausted, with no easy way to double check. The mission usually starts hours before the jet ever moves. Crews show up for a brief that can run 2 or 3 hours on its own, going over the route, the refueling points, the weather, the threat picture. By the time they actually strap in, they've already been awake and working for half a day. Then they climb to altitude and the real test begins. 20 hours is longer than most people's entire waking day. It's long enough to take off in daylight, fly through an entire night, and land the next afternoon having never really slept. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the jet has to refuel mid-air, sometimes more than once on a 20-hour sortie. And that single maneuver resets the entire crew's adrenaline for about 15 minutes. A tanker pulls in close overhead. A boom operator threads a fuel line into a receptacle on the B-52, while both aircraft hold formation at the same speed, and one wrong move from either pilot can end the flight in a way nobody wants to think about. It's the kind of moment that snaps a half-asleep crew wide awake faster than any amount of coffee could. So what do you do with the other 19 hours and 45 minutes? You eat when you can, not when you want to. The in-flight kitchen back at base packs a box lunch, sandwiches, some fruit, maybe a sleeve of crackers, and crews have learned the hard way that it's smart to bring your own food too. Because a box lunch made 12 hours before a 20-hour flight is not exactly fine dining by the time you get to it. There's a tiny electric oven on board for frozen meals, and generations of crew members will tell you the same joke. It either burns the edges or leaves the middle ice cold, and there's no real way to fix that mid-flight except opening it every few minutes and poking at it like you're defusing something. Coffee matters more than food. Crews bring thermoses, request extra jugs from the flight kitchen, and ration caffeine across the mission the way you'd ration fuel. Because here's the thing nobody tells you going in. Your body doesn't know it's supposed to stay awake for 20 straight hours. It just knows it's 3 in the morning and wants to shut down, whether there's a war going on underneath you or not. That's where fatigue management stops being a suggestion and becomes a real medical program. Flight surgeons can prescribe what crews call go pills, low-dose stimulants used specifically for missions over 12 hours, and they're handed out and counted with the same precision as the weapon's load. Pilots take them at planned moments, usually timed right before something demanding like a mid-air refueling, not just whenever someone starts yawning. And there's a flip side to it too. After landing, crews are given what they call no-go pills, sedatives meant to force the body back onto a normal sleep schedule, because you can't just land after a day awake and expect to fall asleep on command. The whole system exists because the Air Force learned through actual crashes that exhausted aircrew make the same mistakes drunk drivers do. They just make them at 30,000 feet. Sleep itself is almost a myth on this jet. There's a small foam pad on the upper deck, barely big enough to lie on, and most crew members will tell you they use it rarely, if ever, because someone always has to be alert. And on a 5-person crew, there's rarely a moment where enough people can stand down at once to make it worth the trouble. Compare that to the B-2, which actually has a fold-out cot for its 2-person crew. The B-52 was built in the 1950s. Comfort was never part of the design brief. And And then there's the bathroom situation, which is somehow both the funniest and most miserable part of this entire job. The B-52 has no real toilet. What it has is a bucket with a seat on it, tucked behind the electronic warfare officer's station, known across generations of crews as the honey bucket. There's also a basic urinal funnel built into the side of the fuselage, and old crew chiefs will tell you that men who could put a bomb on a target from 6 miles up somehow could not hit that funnel to save their lives, to the point where the skin of the aircraft used to corrode underneath it. A lot of crews quietly take something like Imodium before a long sortie, on the simple logic that the fewer trips to that bucket, the better the next 20 hours are going to go. As more women have moved into bomber crews in recent years, the Air Force has actually started adding privacy curtains around that station, which tells you something about just how little thought went into crew dignity when this airplane was designed back in the 1950s. Now here's the part that should genuinely worry you a little. If something goes wrong on this airplane, getting out isn't simple either. The pilots eject upward, the way you'd expect. But the navigator and radar navigator, sitting downstairs in that windowless lower deck, eject straight down through hatches in the floor of the aircraft. That seat needs a minimum altitude and enough forward speed to even work. Eject too low and the parachute simply doesn't have time to open before you hit the ground. And if there's a 6th person on board, an instructor or an extra crew member, they don't get an ejection seat at all. Their plan is to manually bail out through the same hole the navigators leave behind after the navigators have already gone. So for 20 hours straight, 2 members of every crew are sitting on top of a piece of engineering that only works under very specific conditions, doing math problems and watching radar screens like it's just another Tuesday. You'd think knowing that would wreck a person's nerves. Mostly, it doesn't. Crews train on it, brief it before every flight, and then mentally file it away the same way airline passengers ignore the safety card. It's just part of the job. If stories like this are the kind of thing that pulls you in, this channel digs into military life beyond the headlines pretty regularly, so subscribing means you won't miss the next one. So why do people actually want this job? Ask any long-time bomber crew member and you'll hear some version of the same answer. It's not really about the food or the sleep or the bucket behind the EWO seat. It's the crew itself. 5 people who've spent 20 hours together in a windowless tube develop a kind of trust. That's hard to find anywhere else because they've watched each other handle exhaustion, boredom, and the genuine weight of carrying a nuclear-capable aircraft across an ocean and back. There's also the simple fact that very few people on Earth will ever do what they do. Flying a 60-plus-year-old strategic bomber on a mission that can stretch across multiple time zones and multiple sunrises is not a normal job by any measure, and the people who stay in it tend to take real pride in being able to say they did it. And it connects to something bigger than any one mission. Those Cold War crews flying Chrome Dome in the 1960s weren't just testing endurance for fun. They were part of a deterrence strategy built on a simple, brutal idea. If enough nuclear-armed bombers are already in the air at all times, an enemy can't wipe out the entire force in a surprise strike, which means retaliation is always possible. Which means, in theory, nobody pulls the trigger in the first place. That program eventually ended after a string of accidents made continuous airborne nuclear alert too risky to keep running. But the underlying logic never really went away. Decades later, during operations overseas in the early 2000s, B-52 crews were flying combat sorties, stretching past 20 hours from bases, thousands of miles from the target, refueling mid-air from tankers, crossing entire oceans on a single sortie, because the aircraft and the mission demand it just as much today as it did when this program started. The B-52 itself is expected to keep flying into the 2050s, which means crews who haven't even joined the Air Force yet will eventually sit in that same windowless lower deck, eat from the same kind of box lunch, and learn to live with the same honey bucket that crews were complaining about back in Vietnam. The airplane changes engines and avionics over the decades. The human part of the job barely changes at all. That's the real story behind this aircraft. It was never really about the bombs. It was about how long the human body and mind can be pushed before something breaks, and how the Air Force spent 70 years quietly building an entire system, pills, schedules, food, bathroom buckets and all, just to keep that line from ever being crossed. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.
You're looking at a cockpit the size of a bathtub. You've been sitting in it for 9 hours. Outside, it's 40,000 feet, minus 65 degrees, and the nearest friendly ground is somewhere over the horizon. Your mission isn't done. You can't land. You can't stretch. You can't even look away from your instruments for more than a few seconds. And you have to pee. This is the reality of long-range combat aviation, and it's something the military doesn't put in the recruitment brochures. Fighter pilots are some of the most physically and mentally elite people on Earth, but their cockpits are, by design, tiny, isolated, and deeply uncomfortable. So what actually happens inside one of those jets during a 10-hour mission? How do pilots eat, stay hydrated, manage their bodily functions, and remain sharp enough to make life or death decisions after nearly half a day in the air? The answers are stranger than you'd expect. To understand this, you have to start with the aircraft itself, because the cockpit determines almost everything else. A single-seat fighter, like the F-15 or F-16, gives you roughly 30 cubic feet of space. Compare that to your car, which gives you about 100. Now imagine sitting in that car seat, strapped in so tight you can barely move your hips, wearing a G-suit that squeezes your legs like a blood pressure cuff, a helmet that weighs close to 5 pounds, and an oxygen mask clamped to your face for the entire flight. That's the starting point, and the mission hasn't even begun yet. Long-range combat missions became a defining feature of modern air power during the Gulf War, and haven't gone away since. When the Air Force needs to strike a target thousands of miles away, or maintain air superiority over a theatre that requires continuous coverage, pilots can be airborne for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. B-2 stealth bomber crews have documented missions exceeding 30 hours with air refueling. Even standard fighter escort and strike missions routinely push past the 8-hour mark, when you factor in the transit to and from the combat zone. Which means everything about the pilot's body becomes a logistical problem that someone, somewhere, had to solve. Start with food. The military has developed what are called pilot meals, which sound like something off a business class menu, but are actually closer to a science experiment. The priority isn't taste, it's function. Pilots need enough calories to maintain cognitive performance without the kind of digestive load that causes discomfort, gas, or the urgent need to use a bathroom. High-fibre foods are essentially off the table before a long mission. So are carbonated drinks, cruciferous vegetables, beans, anything that causes bloating. The reasoning is both practical and medical. At altitude, gas in your digestive system expands. The same physics that makes unopened chip bags puff up at 30,000 feet applies to what's inside your body. What pilots actually eat before a long sortie tends to be low-residue foods. Think white bread, rice, lean protein, bananas. Things that digest cleanly and don't create problems at altitude. Some squadrons have specific pre-mission meal protocols, almost like an athlete preparing for a race, down to what time you eat relative to takeoff. During the mission itself, if you're in a fighter cockpit, you're eating out of a bag with your hands while managing a 40,000-pound aircraft at 500 knots. There are in-flight meals for cockpit use, essentially specialised energy bars and high-calorie snacks designed to be opened and consumed with one hand, with gloves on, without crumbling into sensitive avionics. Tube foods, similar to what astronauts use, were tested and sometimes still appear in long-range operations. You bite the end off a tube and squeeze. Not glamorous, effective. Hydration is actually a bigger concern than food. Pilots can go several hours without eating and maintain performance. But dehydration impairs judgment faster than almost any other factor short of G-force blackout or hypoxia. The cockpit environment makes this worse because the pressurized, climate-controlled air inside the jet is extremely dry. Pilots lose moisture through every breath. A mission that feels like it's going fine can quietly be degrading your cognitive performance through dehydration before you even feel thirsty. Modern flight suits include a hydration system for longer missions. Essentially, a bladder of water with a hose routed into the cockpit that pilots can sip from through a valve in their oxygen mask. But drinking water means eventually needing to get rid of water. And in a fighter cockpit, there is no bathroom. This is the part nobody glamorizes in the Top Gun sequel. Military aviation has grappled with the urination problem for decades, and the solutions have evolved in ways that range from engineering marvel to genuinely uncomfortable improvisation. The earliest approach was simply to not drink water. Pilots went into long missions dehydrated on purpose to avoid the problem. Unsurprisingly, this caused a different set of performance issues, and the military eventually figured out that pilots making critical navigation and weapons decisions were doing so with impaired cognition because they'd stopped drinking fluids 6 hours earlier. The next solution was the Piddle Pack, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an absorbent bag with a tube and a one-way valve, similar in concept to what astronauts use. The pilot uses it in the cockpit, the bag seals, and the contents are disposed of after landing. Using one while strapped into a 5-point harness in a G-suit at altitude while flying a combat aircraft is not a simple task. Pilots describe it as one of those skills that takes practice and isn't covered in ground school. There is an entire body of institutional knowledge passed down informally in squadrons about how to manage this without making a significant mess in a very small space. Female pilots faced an even larger problem, since the design of Piddle Packs was created almost exclusively with male anatomy in mind, which wasn't much of a consideration for most of aviation's history. It's been an ongoing issue the military has slowly moved to address with modified designs. For longer-range bomber missions, some aircraft have what amounts to a very basic onboard toilet, a tube system that routes waste to a containment tank. In the B-52 and similar large aircraft, there's slightly more physical space to work with, though privacy is not a concept that exists. For crews of 2 or more, you work out an unspoken understanding with your crewmate. You look at your instruments, Everyone pretends they can't hear anything. Moving on. If the challenge of eating and urination sounds like something that would break a person's focus, that's because it can. But the bigger threat to mission performance isn't the logistics of bodily functions, it's sleep deprivation. Long missions don't just tire the body, they degrade the specific cognitive functions that pilots need most. Situation awareness, decision speed, threat assessment, the ability to rapidly interpret conflicting information and act on it. These are the skills that take the hardest hit after 6 or more hours in the air. Fatigue doesn't feel the way people expect. It doesn't hit like exhaustion after a sprint. It creeps in. You start making small errors. You miss a radio call. You misread a coordinate. In a non-combat environment, that's a training note. In combat, it's a different conversation. The military's approach to managing this is layered. The first layer is selection. The pilots who fly the longest, most demanding missions are chosen in part because of documented ability to perform under sustained physical and cognitive stress. The training pipeline filters for this. But selection only goes so far. The second layer is pharmaceuticals, and this is one of the less discussed aspects of long-range aviation. Go pills and no-go pills are real, and they have official names. Dextroamphetamine, known in aviation circles as go pills, have been used by military aviators for decades to sustain alertness on long missions. The Air Force has formal protocols around their use, dosing, timing, and mandatory rest periods after. They're not handed out casually. A flight surgeon has to approve their use, and there are documented cases where stimulant use during missions has been scrutinized, including a high-profile friendly fire incident in Afghanistan in 2002, where go pill use was raised as a contributing factor. The military's position has evolved since then, with more stringent controls, but the pills haven't gone away. The operational reality is that there are missions where you simply cannot have a pilot falling asleep at the stick, and ground coffee isn't rated for a combat aircraft. No-go pills are the counterpart. Typically a short-acting sedative, they're used post-mission to help pilots sleep during the narrow rest window before they're expected to fly again. The concern is always the same. You need the pilot sharp for the next mission, not still buzzing from stimulants at 3 a.m. in a forward operating base. We cover this kind of deep operational content every week. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Beyond pharmaceuticals, there are behavioral techniques. Cockpit discipline on long missions includes deliberate scan patterns designed to keep the brain actively engaged, rather than slipping into autopilot complacency. Crew coordination on multi-crew aircraft means distributing cognitive load so no single person is carrying full responsibility for awareness at all times. Periodic radio check-ins with AWACS or ground control serve a dual function, communicating mission status and, less formally, keeping the crew engaged with the outside world. There's also something pilots describe as the wall, which hits differently than normal tiredness. It typically arrives somewhere between hours 5 and 7 of a long mission, depending on pre-mission rest, how intense the early phases were, and individual variation. It's a period where fatigue sharpens into something more acute. Experienced pilots know it's coming and have developed personal routines for pushing through it. Eating, moving what little can be moved in a flight suit, going through checklists verbally even when they've long since been memorized. The goal is to keep the brain from entering a maintenance mode. It was never designed to resist. The physical toll adds another dimension. Sustained G-forces during maneuvering portions of a mission cause real strain, even with anti-G suits. The suit inflates around your legs and abdomen to keep blood from pooling away from your brain during high G turns. But it does nothing for the cumulative physical fatigue of hours of micromuscular tension as your body fights against forces it was never designed for. After a 2-hour training exercise with heavy maneuvering, pilots walk away with the muscle soreness of a hard gym session. After 10 hours of a combat sortie with intermittent high G work, the physical depletion is real. What ties all of this together is preparation. The pilots who make it through the longest, hardest missions aren't doing so through willpower alone. They're doing it through weeks and months of specific training for exactly this scenario. They know what they'll eat and when. They've practiced managing hydration. They've used the piddle pack enough times in a ground simulator that it's not an emergency when it happens at 40,000 feet. They've been through enough go-pill protocols to know precisely how stimulants interact with their personal physiology. They've flown enough long-range training sorties to recognize what hour 6 feels like and know they can get to hour 10. The cockpit is the smallest, least forgiving office in the world, but the people sitting in it have been engineered, selected and trained to function in it anyway. It just requires solving a lot of problems that never make it into the highlight reel. Fighter pilots started as ordinary people who went through extraordinary preparation. The 10-hour mission isn't just a flight, it's the end product of everything that came before it. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet. "14 people climb into a 40-year-old cargo plane with a 105mm howitzer bolted to the side of it. And for the next 8 hours, nobody on board will see the sun. They take off after dark. They land after dark. In between, they fly slow circles over enemy territory at 3,000 feet, close enough that a man on the ground with a rifle could end the whole mission with a lucky shot. And they do it on purpose. Because somewhere underneath them, American or Allied troops are pinned down, and the only thing standing between them and being overrun is whatever's hanging out of the side of this aircraft. This is the AC-130 gunship, and the 8-hour mission is the easy part of the job description. The hard part is everything else. The eating, the sleeping, the bathroom breaks, the boredom, the 11 seconds of pure terror, repeated as many times as the mission demands. Here's what almost nobody outside the gunship community actually understands. This isn't a fighter jet making one fast pass and going home. A fighter can loiter over a target for maybe 30 minutes before it needs to refuel. The AC-130 can refuel in the air, mid-flight, in the dark, and keep going. Missions have stretched past 24 hours. One of the longest on record ran for 36 hours straight, non-stop, crew swapping who was awake and who was resting, the plane never landing once. 8 hours isn't even the long version. 8 hours is a normal Tuesday. So the question becomes obvious. How do you keep 5, 10, 14 human beings alert, fed, calm, and ready to make split-second life or death decisions for that long? In a plane with no windows to speak of, no bathroom worth the name, and a war happening underneath the floor. start with who's actually on board, because the crew is bigger than people assume. Up front, you've got two pilots flying what is essentially a slow, deliberate circle around the target, a maneuver crews call the pylon turn, banking the aircraft so the guns on one side stay locked onto a fixed point on the ground for as long as it takes. Behind them, a flight engineer is watching the four engines like a hawk, because losing one this far from home with this much weight on board is not a small problem. Then there's the fire control officer, the navigator, the electronic warfare officer, and on the newer models, sensor operators running infrared cameras precise enough to tell the difference between a rifle and a shovel from over a mile up. In the back, gunners and loadmasters are physically loading rounds, heavy ones, by hand, over and over for hours. Every one of those jobs requires total focus. And every one of those people still has to eat. Crews will tell you the food on a gunship is not glamorous. It's whatever can survive a flight without spoiling, doesn't need to be cooked, and can be eaten one-handed without taking your eyes off a screen. Protein bars, sandwiches packed before takeoff, and, almost universally, mentioned by crew after crew across different squadrons and different decades, there's one item that comes up over and over: muffins. Cheap, mass-produced, ridiculously calorie-dense muffins, eaten by the dozen over the course of a single flight. Because on an 8-hour mission, your body is burning through fuel just from the adrenaline and the cold and the constant low-grade tension, and there's no time for a real meal. One former loadmaster estimated his crew was putting away well over 4,000 calories of muffins alone on a single sortie. Not because anyone wanted to, because the body demanded it, and a muffin was the fastest thing to get into your hand. There's no real kitchen up here, there's barely a bathroom. What there is a job, and the job doesn't pause for hunger. Therefore, the crew builds a rhythm around the mission instead of around meals, eating when there's a lull, eating between target runs, eating with one eye still on the radio. But that rhythm only works if everyone trusts everyone else to do their job perfectly every single time. And that trust gets built somewhere most people never see: the hours of nothing, before the moment that matters. Most of an 8-hour mission is not combat, it's transit. It's holding a pattern over a quiet stretch of desert or mountain, watching, waiting, listening to radio chatter from troops who may or may not need help tonight. It is, by every account from people who've actually done it, mind-numbingly boring for stretches of time anyway. And that boredom is dangerous in its own way, because the moment everyone relaxes is exactly the moment something can go wrong on the ground, fast, and the gunship needs to be ready in seconds, not minutes. So crews develop their own ways of staying sharp without losing the edge. Dark humour, inside jokes that would mean nothing to an outsider, and everything to the people in that fuselage. Pranks that, by more than one account, have sent flight surgeons and psychologists running for the door, trying to figure out if everyone on board is actually okay. It sounds strange from the outside. From the inside, it's survival. You cannot keep 14 people at maximum readiness for 8 straight hours through fear alone. You keep them sharp by keeping them human, by letting off pressure in small doses so it doesn't build up and break something when it matters most. But then the radio call comes in. Troops in contact. And everything changes in the space of a breath. The boredom is gone instantly. Every position on the aircraft snaps into a role they've rehearsed hundreds of times. The pilots bank into the pylon turn. The sensor operators lock onto the coordinates. The fire control officer is talking to a joint terminal attack controller on the ground, a soldier in the dirt, under fire, calling out exactly where the enemy is relative to his own position, in real time, while bullets are flying near him. One mistake in that conversation, one number transposed, 1 second of hesitation, and the difference is between saving the people on the ground and becoming the reason they don't go home. This is the part of the job that crews describe almost reverently, and almost nobody talks about casually. There's a standard on board these aircraft that doesn't bend. Crews call it the perfection standard, and it isn't a slogan. It's the literal operating reality of the job. A single error doesn't just risk the 14 people on the plane, it can mean good people on the ground. People who are trusting a voice on the radio they will never meet die because of it. So nothing is improvised. Nothing is guessed. The targeting process is slow, deliberate, and checked, even when the situation on the ground is anything but slow. And then the guns fire. Depending on the version of the aircraft and the threat, that might be a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm autocannon, or rapid-fire 25mm cannons, each one suited to a different kind of target, each one loaded by hand in the back of the plane by a crew member working in a cramped, freezing, deafening space, while the aircraft is banking in a tight circle 3,000 feet above a firefight. Loadmasters have described physically muscling rounds into position during the heaviest nights of fighting, over and over, until their arms gave out and somebody else took over. From the ground, the effect is almost mythical. Troops who've called in an AC-130 during a firefight describe it as the single most reassuring sound in the world. The deep, steady growl of that aircraft circling overhead in the dark. Because it means the math of the fight just changed in their favour. The gunship doesn't need daylight. It doesn't need clear skies. Its entire reason for existing is to own the night, to see what the enemy can't see it seeing, and to end a threat before the enemy even understands where the shot came from. But the crew doesn't get to celebrate that moment. Therefore, almost as soon as the target is neutralised and the ground unit confirms they're clear, the aircraft has to reset. Because there might be another call 10 minutes later, or an hour later, or nothing at all for the rest of the flight. The same 5 people who were locked in a life or death targeting sequence 90 seconds ago are back to scanning empty terrain, eating a muffin, checking fuel, waiting. This back and forth, long stretches of nothing, sudden bursts of the highest stakes work imaginable, then back to nothing, happens again and again across an 8-hour mission. It is, by the description of people who've lived it, one of the strangest psychological experiences a human being can have. Your body and mind have to be capable of going from half-asleep boredom to surgical precision in the time it takes a radio call to finish, and then come back down again, over and over, for the length of an entire workday compressed into darkness. It takes a toll. Crew members who've flown hundreds of these missions talk openly now about what that switch does to a person over years of repetition. A brain that gets rewired to treat split-second, life-or-death decision-making as normal, and then struggles to turn that wiring off once the deployment ends and life goes back to something ordinary. The intensity that keeps a 14-person crew alive at 3,000 feet over hostile ground doesn't just disappear when the wheels touch down back home. For some, it follows them for years. And still, when the sun comes up and the aircraft finally turns for home after 8 hours circling in the dark, the job isn't really finished. There's a debrief. There's the next mission already on the schedule, sometimes the same night, sometimes the next. There's another set of muffins to pack, another full tank of fuel, another 14 people who will climb back into that same airframe and do it all over again. Because somewhere out there, another unit on the ground is going to need that sound overhead. That low, steady growl in the dark that means somebody is watching and somebody is ready. That's the job, not one moment of glory. Hundreds of hours of waiting, broken by seconds that decide who goes home and who doesn't. Carried by a crew running on muffins, training, and the kind of trust in each other that most people never have to test in their entire lives.